This is the second of 3 podcasts that cover the plasma membrane. And in this podcast, we're going to focus on the function. We learned in the first podcast, in the first video, that the plasma membrane is composed of these phospholipids, 2 layers of phospholipids. Well, this structural phospholipid bilayer is what gives the plasma membrane its first function, and that is to serve as a barrier and separate the inside environment from the outside environment. Now, as it functions as a barrier, it also regulates what's able to enter the cell and what cannot enter the cell. And the plasma membrane will allow some substances to pass through while restricting others. And this characteristic is called selectively permeable. The word permeable or permeate means to pass through. Selectively literally means selection. It chooses what can enter and what can't enter. And what allows it to select what can enter or not is the characteristics of that phospholipid bilayer. So let's take a closer look at the lipid bilayer. So I'm going to draw a few phospholipids here and create my own little drawing of the plasma membrane. Remember that a phospholipid has this polar head, which is hydrophilic. That's what these circles represent, the hydrophilic polar heads. And the lines I'm drawing represent the nonpolar hydrophobic fatty acid tails. Okay? Now, since these heads are hydrophilic, that means water is able to come right up to the edge of the plasma membrane. So this would be the inside of my cell here at the bottom. Water can come right up to the edge of the plasma membrane because these heads are hydrophilic. Now out here is the outside of the cell. This would be my extracellular matrix out here. And water can also come right up to the edge where these polar heads are. Again, because the heads are polar and water is also polar. So water can come right up to the edge on the outside and right up to the edge on the inside. But water cannot cross. It cannot pass through. And the reason for that is these fatty acid tails. These tails are an oil. Okay, it's a lipid. These fatty acids are lipids, which means they're hydrophobic. Something that is hydrophilic, water-loving, and even water itself will not pass through these tails, which are hydrophobic. So here's what that means. Compounds that are also hydrophilic may not pass directly through the plasma membrane. So can water? Water obviously is polar, it's hydrophilic. It's water itself, so water is attracted to itself. Can water pass through the plasma membrane? That answer is no. Water cannot pass directly through the plasma membrane. How about something like glucose? C6H12O6. Glucose, you learned in Chapter 2, is a carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are also hydrophilic. Could glucose pass directly through the plasma membrane? That answer is no, it cannot. So things that are hydrophilic, water-loving, cannot pass directly through the plasma membrane. Now, how about things that are hydrophobic? Let's say I had another lipid over here, a fat or cholesterol that's trying to get in. So I'll just write cholesterol. I know my handwriting's pretty bad. That's an E. Cholesterol. Okay. Can cholesterol pass through the plasma membrane? That answer is yes, it can. Why? Because cholesterol is hydrophobic. These tails are also hydrophobic. So can something that's hydrophobic mix with something else that's hydrophobic? Yes, it can. So cholesterol would be able to pass through. Another type of lipid, some type of steroid or hormone, would it be able to pass through the plasma membrane? Yes, it can pass directly through the plasma membrane. So this is one of the ways that the plasma membrane selects what can pass through. It's dependent upon solubility. If something is soluble in water, like glucose or even water itself, it cannot pass in the plasma membrane. So no, it cannot pass through. But if something is hydrophobic, another kind of lipid, would it be able to pass through the plasma membrane? And that answer is yes, it would be able to pass through. Another component that determines whether or not a substance can pass through is size. Things that are very, very small, just a few atoms big. For example, oxygen. Oxygen travels in pairs, O2, because it's stable that way. O2 can pass through the plasma membrane because it's very small. Carbon dioxide, CO2. Carbon dioxide can also pass through the plasma membrane because it's only 3 atoms big. So oxygen, carbon dioxide, these are compounds that are nonpolar, they do not have charges to them, and they're very small in size, so they would be able to pass directly through the plasma membrane. Things that are larger and hydrophilic, like glucose, water itself, it cannot pass directly through the plasma membrane. Now, having said that, does that mean glucose cannot get into the cell? Or water cannot get into the cell? No, it doesn't mean that. Glucose can enter the cell. It has to. Glucose is our main energy source, so we do have to be able to take glucose in. Water does have to be able to come into the cell. We've got to maintain this fluid environment inside and outside the cell, and water is what's creating that fluid environment. So glucose and water and other substances that are hydrophilic, they can enter the cell, but they must use what's called a channel protein. Right here in this drawing, you see a membrane channel protein. And literally, it's a channel. It's like a little tunnel. You can tell by the picture. It's this little gap or tunnel. And this tunnel is within these phospholipids. So something like glucose, again, C6H12O6, would enter the cell by way of these channel proteins. Water also enters the cell through these little channels. These channels that allow water to pass through are called aquaporins. They're like little pores. They're not shown in this picture, but they're like little pores that are found throughout the plasma membrane, and they allow water to pass through. So things that are hydrophilic are able to enter the cell. They just do not pass directly through the plasma membrane. Instead, they're going to pass through the channels. So these characteristics are what gives the plasma membrane the ability to be selectively permeable. It's going to be dependent upon size, like in the case of carbon dioxide and water, and it's going to be dependent upon solubility, like in the case of the glucose being hydrophilic, it cannot pass through. Lipids being hydrophobic, it can pass through. Now, the second function of the plasma membrane was to control cellular activities, and it does this because of all the proteins it has embedded within the plasma membrane. So, if you'll notice this picture, this photograph, you can kind of see the basic framework of the membrane, again, is this phospholipid bilayer with the polar heads and nonpolar tails. But then you also see all of these other structures that are found within, the purples and the greens and the reds and the yellows kind of intermingled. All of these different structures that are found within the plasma membrane give it the characteristic of being described as a fluid mosaic. So the plasma membrane is described as a fluid mosaic. Now the word fluid is pretty easy. Fluid means liquid. Well, these phospholipids are liquids. They are like a little oil layer that's surrounding it. So all these little heads and tails are a fluid, and these components, all these different structures that you see embedded within that I have circled, all of these are literally floating around within that phospholipid bilayer. So that's where the fluid comes from. The phospholipids are a fluid. Now, the word mosaic in artistic terms is referring to an image of lots of different colors and textures and sizes and shapes, and that's what all of these other structures are embedded within the plasma membrane. They're creating that characteristic of being a mosaic. So let's take a look at these structures that are found within the plasma membrane. So first up is cholesterol. Cholesterol are all these little tiny yellow pieces that you see embedded within those fatty acids. And it makes sense that they would be within the fatty acids, right? Because cholesterol is a lipid, and lipids would be found within other lipids. Now, cholesterol has a stabilizing effect. Remember that these phospholipids are a fluid, I just mentioned, and fluids flow, they move. Having cholesterol kind of spread throughout these phospholipids help to hold them in place and anchor them together so that the movements aren't too sporadic, they're not too tumultuous. Within there. So cholesterol has a stabilizing effect. It strengthens the plasma membrane. You can kind of think of the cholesterol as little pieces of superglue that are kind of spread throughout the plasma membrane, and it anchors and holds all these phospholipids in place and keeps them attached and together. Now the rest of the structures listed here, the enzymes, receptors, transport proteins, and glycoproteins, all of these are different types of proteins that are going to play a role in the functioning of the cell. Enzymes you learned about in Chapter 2. Enzymes are proteins that function as catalysts. They're going to start chemical reactions, they're going to speed up chemical reactions, and enzymes can be found on the inside of the plasma membrane, like this one right here is on the inside. They can also be found on the outside of the plasma membrane, like this one right here. And they can also even spread through the plasma membrane as well. So enzymes can be found throughout the plasma membrane. No matter where they're found, if they're on the inside or outside, they're always going to function in chemical reactions. Receptors are a second type of protein. Receptors are like identification tags. They give each cell a specific identity so that your cells are able to recognize one another, and they're also able to recognize specific chemicals. So things like hormones are able to affect specific cells because those specific cells have receptors that recognize that hormone. Okay, so receptors are proteins that serve as identification tags so that cells can communicate with one another, and so chemicals like hormones can communicate with other cells. The next example are transport proteins. Transport proteins are these proteins like the channels that I mentioned just a second ago that allow substances that may be hydrophilic to pass through the plasma membrane. So they function literally in transport. They allow substances to enter and leave the plasma membrane. Lastly are glycoproteins. Glycoproteins are proteins embedded within the membrane that have a sugar flag on them, a carbohydrate flag attached to them. This prefix glyco literally means sweet in medical terminology. It'll be one of your med terms that comes up. You know, the aspect of class you're learning all these different medical terms. One of the med terms you're going to have is glyco, and glyco literally means sweet. It's in reference to sugar. So these proteins that you see that have these little yellow flags on them, here's an example. Here's an example right here you see, and here they're labeled carbohydrate chains. It's these carbohydrate chains that give the proteins their prefix glycoproteins. Now, glycoproteins function very similar to receptors. They allow cell-to-cell recognition. So one cell can distinguish self from non-self. For example, in the immune system, your white blood cells know the body's own cells. And when a different type of cell, like a bacterial cell, invades the body, it can tell that that bacterial cell is foreign. That's because they would not have the same glycoproteins that self cells have. So glycoproteins function very similar to receptors. These two function very similar in that they give cells specific identities. So they're able to recognize one another, and they're able to recognize hormones, and it allows communication between two cells. So all of these different structures, cholesterol being a lipid, and then all of these proteins, enzymes, receptors, transport proteins, and glycoproteins, these determine cell-to-cell interactions and cell-to-chemical interactions, and that's how the cell membrane, the plasma membrane, can function in cellular activities. It's because of these proteins that are found embedded within that plasma membrane.